be the first to admit that I'm one of the most skeptical people I know. I don't believe in ghosts or any other paranormal stuff. I'm quick to dismiss stories that seem fake or at the very least fabricated. That's why I'm completely at a loss for words at what happened to me just weeks ago. I wanted to write all of this while it was fresh in my mind. I can't explain what happened to me, and to be honest, I'm still terrified. I thought to myself, maybe if I write what happened to me and share it with the internet, maybe someone out there can explain what happened. Well, hopefully somebody out there can explain. My friend Steve and his wife were going out of town for the weekend for their anniversary. The two of them don't travel alone a lot because they have 2 children and a dog. I know for some people that's a first world problem, and you're correct, but Steve isn't struggling financially. He built this massive home in the middle of nowhere because he likes privacy, and if you're fortunate enough to do that, I can't blame you. Well, for Steve and his wife, the stars were about to align perfectly. The 2 kids were going out of town for some type of school trip, so they were going to be alone with just the dog. When Steve told me all of this, I insisted on going over and watching the dog for the weekend so he and his wife could go on a romantic weekend getaway. He agreed, and the plan was set in stone. I would be watching his beautiful golden retriever for the weekend. I made my way to the house on Friday afternoon. I didn't work weekends, so I planned on just staying there Friday through Sunday. Steve stocked the house full of food and snacks for me and made sure I had everything I needed. It was a bit overkill for a weekend pet sitting job, but I wasn't complaining. I love dogs, and I love quiet weekends, so win-win for me. Now for the scary part. On Friday night, the dog and I just hung out and watched movies. Steve sent me a text around 9 p.m. and said, "Don't get scared being all alone in that house. It can get pretty spooky at night when you're by yourself." I gave him a single LOL text back and told him to shut up. As I said before, I'm a very skeptical person. I don't get scared of empty houses or being alone in the middle of nowhere. I'm well aware that anything can happen, so I just don't get scared easily. I slept in the spare bedroom, and Steve's dog came with me. We went to bed around 1 a.m. At 3:21 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of the dog barking downstairs. It was that loud and vicious barking. I won't lie, that actually did scare me. But more of the surprise scare, not that scared out of my skin kind of scare. I made my way downstairs, and the entire time, the dog never stopped barking. I finally found the dog in the kitchen barking at the door that led to the basement. All the hair on his back was standing straight up, and the dog looked incredibly spooked by something. I was calling his name and trying to calm him down, but he just wouldn't stop barking. I grabbed the doorknob, and this sent the dog into a spiral. He was now running back and forth barking and just going insane. Of course, my first thought was maybe some kind of intruder in the basement. Possible, but unlikely. Steve has all that super fancy security equipment, so breaking in is not something that's easy. I grabbed a big knife from the kitchen and opened the door. The dog ran to the doorway but didn't go down into the basement. He just stood at the frame and growled, his hair still sticking straight up. I turned the light on and descended the stairs. I started yelling a bunch of stuff, pretending to be a lot tougher than I am, but I heard or saw nothing down there. I tried calling the dog down into the basement, but he wasn't moving. I even went as far as to look all around the basement to give my mind some peace. It's a finished basement, so I looked in closets, in every corner, behind furniture, and even in the bathroom that's down there. No intruder and no evil ghosts. The only thing I did notice was how unreasonably cold it was down there. I know it's a basement, but I've been down there a million times, and it's not that cold. Even in the dead of winter, it's never that cold. At the end of the day, a cold basement is no reason to freak out and run away. I spent the rest of the night in the living room. It took a while, but the dog finally calmed down, and we both fell asleep again. The next day, the dog was completely fine. We played outside for a while, and I just spent most of the day listening to music and watching movies. I went down in the basement at one point during the day, and the temperature was completely normal. It felt like the rest of the house. I didn't really spend much time giving it thought, and just went about the rest of the day. That night, I decided to stay on the couch, just in case the dog had another basement door incident. I wanted to stay up later, but I ended up falling asleep while watching a movie. Once again, at almost the exact same time, I woke up to the dog throwing a fit and barking like the house was on fire or something. I stormed into the kitchen, and again, I tried getting the dog to stop barking, but he wouldn't listen for the second night in a row. But this night was different. I didn't think it was possible, but the dog was even more erratic that night than he was on the previous night. I knew nothing was down there, so I told him repeatedly that it was okay. It was like I wasn't even there. When I grabbed the doorknob this time, instead of continuing to bark, he started to cry and whimper. It was the strangest thing. I let go of the knob, and when I tried to console the dog, he started barking again. I was annoyed and confused. One last time, I grabbed the knob and went downstairs. Again, the dog started to cry and still wouldn't follow me into the basement. This time was different. It was still cold down there, just like the previous night, but this time it stunk so badly. I don't know how to describe the smell other than just bad, but perhaps the weirdest thing was that some of the pictures he had on the wall of his family were knocked over, and the bar stools down there were also knocked to the ground. Other than that, nothing else was misplaced or destroyed. I picked up the bar stools and also the pictures and just set them on the bar. The smell was so overbearing that I didn't even want to be down there anymore. I went back upstairs, and for the first 30 minutes or so, the dog continued to bark, and I tried to figure out what could be the reason for the smell. When the dog finally calmed down, I gave him a treat and we both fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning, I went into the basement to try to get to the bottom of the smell, but the smell was gone, not even a lingering odor. Also, the dog followed me down, and he was happy as can be. For 2 nights, that dog refused to come into the basement with me, but today, he went down there without a care in the world. I was completely stumped. I had no clue what had happened the previous 2 nights. Steve got home around 1 in the morning, and as you may expect, his dog was jumping for joy. His wife took the dog outside, and I started catching up with Steve for a bit. He asked how everything was, and I told him that, for the most part, everything was great. He gave me a confused look when I said for the most part, so I explained in detail what happened over the weekend. I totally expected him to laugh and assume I was playing a joke on him, but he didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just stood there. He finally looked down and told me that, occasionally, when the dog was a puppy, he would have these barking fits and just go crazy barking at that door. Apparently, he hadn't done it in years, so Steve forgot about it. They never knew the reason, but then one night, he just stopped doing it. I could tell Steve was freaked out, a lot more freaked out than I was. We talked about it for a little longer, but ultimately, I kept telling Steve not to worry, and it's probably nothing. It's been 2 weeks, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it. Steve told me that since they've been home, the dog has been completely normal and has had no basement door episodes. I've tried looking into it myself, but I haven't found anything that could logically explain what happened. Just when I think I may have found something that sort of explains what happened, once I add everything up, it doesn't make sense. So what's the deal? Can someone out there explain to me why that dog was acting this way? What was the smell, and where did it come from? I need help, people. I'm losing sleep, and I don't even live in that house. I just want some sort of answer. I don't know if this is considered your typical scary story, but it's definitely freaky and very unnerving. The more time that's gone by, the scarier it becomes for me. I'd love to share it and see what people think. It was a few years ago now. I had just broken up with my boyfriend and moved into this cute little apartment. It was an entire apartment complex. The complex itself was beautiful, quiet, and elegant. I quickly made friends with neighbors and several of the other tenants. It was just a nice and friendly little community. A few months into my lease, I thought I heard the sound of running coming from the hallway one night when I was getting ready for bed. I looked out the peephole of the door, but didn't see anything. There weren't any kids in my building, so I couldn't imagine who would be running at that hour. But strange things happen, so I didn't question. The next few nights, I heard the sound again. I didn't get up and look because it just didn't seem that important to me at the time. It's worth noting that my apartment is on the ground level, and my windows face a beautiful courtyard. The door to the apartment is still inside the building, and you need a key to get into the building. It took a little while to get used to the windows being at ground level at first, because if you wanted to, you could come right up to my bedroom window. I will say that I wasn't worried about anybody in this community doing that. I'm just stating that it was something on my mind when I first moved in. However, that information is about to become relevant, because one night, I woke up to what sounded like giggling outside my bedroom window. It was weird for sure, but I just figured some kids were acting stupid and hanging out too close to my window. I tapped the window glass and made a loud shushing noise. The giggling stopped for just a second, and then a faint tapping sound could be heard on the other side of the glass. It freaked me out, but I wasn't about to let some kids have that satisfaction over me. Once I composed myself, I grabbed the curtain and whipped it open. There was nobody there. I was looking at the quiet night courtyard and nothing more. Even if some kids were out there, I have no idea where they would have gone that fast. I closed the curtain and shrugged it off. I wasn't about to let some kids ruin my sleep. This weird giggling outside my window continued for a few nights. I just learned to ignore it. I have young nieces and nephews, and usually when I ignore their stupid pranks, they stop doing whatever they're doing. That was my plan with these giggling kids. I assumed that if I just stopped acknowledging them, they would stop trying to mess with me, and unless they gave me a reason to report them, I wasn't going to bother the apartment complex manager with this. I think it was 2 days later while I was at work that I received an email from the complex manager. She seemed short in the email. She asked if I could stop at the main office when I got home from work. She had to show me something, and she claimed it was urgent. I told her I could stop by after work. I remember all day long being stressed about it. I was worried my rent money didn't clear or something like that. When I showed up, she told me to lock the door. She started talking quietly, almost in a whisper. This one guy who works in the security office came in and sat next to me. The manager told me that while the security guard was monitoring some footage, he came across this. She showed me security camera footage of the hallway where my apartment is located. Around 2 a.m, 2 small hooded figures approached my door. They looked about the size of children who were maybe around 10 or 12. They were just standing there in the grainy footage. It looked like they were standing about an inch away from the door. The scariest part of this was that when she fast-forwarded the footage, they didn't move at all. It was nearly 10 minutes of them just standing extremely close to my apartment door. Before they finally walked away, one of the small figures reached for the doorknob and tried opening the door. You can clearly see them jostling the door a few times, but it doesn't open. After the 10 minutes in the video, they skip away from the sight of the camera. I was finally freaked out. Whoever these kids were, they were targeting me for some reason. I told the security officer and the manager about the window incident, but when they looked back at the footage, they found nothing. We still called the police and gave them a statement. They said if anything else happens, give them a call, but at that point, there really was nothing they could do. The security officer attempted to see if they could find out where the kids skipped off to when they left my apartment door, but it's almost like they vanished. They couldn't find them on any other camera on the entire complex. The next night, I decided to stay awake. I was going to catch these kids one way or another. But that night, there was nothing. No giggles and no sounds from the hall. It was about a week later, and I heard something coming from the hall. It was about 1:30 in the morning. I muted the TV and listened intently. I heard the sound of my doorknob rattling around. It was happening. The kids were back at my door. I ran over nervously and yelled for them to get away. I could hear a child laughing, and then another soft child voice whisper, "Mom, we're home. Just open the door and let us in." I didn't say anything. I looked through the peephole and just saw 2 small figures with their heads down. The voice whispered again, "Please let us in. We're home now, please." That last please that the child said almost sounded desperate. I didn't care. I yelled that their mother doesn't live here anymore and that I was going to call the cops. Both kids started to giggle. Then the doorknob started to shake again. One of the kids started throwing their body into the door, but it wouldn't budge. I stood there holding the door for a minute. I didn't hear laughing anymore, and the doorknob wasn't shaking. When I looked one last time, nobody was out there. I was still too afraid to open the door, just in case they were just outside of my view. I called the police, and the cops were quick to assume it was just local kids playing a prank on me. I didn't argue with that because it seemed like the most logical explanation. I finished with my statement, and that was that. A few days later, I ran into the apartment manager in the parking lot. She pulled me aside and asked if I had experienced anything since that last time. I told her no, and that I was sure it was just some local kids. She made a weird face and told me she wasn't so sure. She told me that the woman who lived in the apartment before me was strange. She didn't give me a whole bunch of information for privacy reasons, but she was fairly confident that something horrible happened with that woman's children. She didn't elaborate or give any details. She didn't even give me the name. She just implied that something horrible happened and left it at that. She said that she had already said too much and she didn't want to get into trouble for sharing personal information. She told me to be careful and just keep locking my doors. I'll never forget her walking away saying, "This wasn't a prank." To my knowledge, I don't think those kids ever visited my apartment again while I was there. I've spent some time trying to figure out exactly what happened, like who these kids were and what the apartment manager meant. Was she implying that these kids were like ghosts or something? I know that seems insane, and I'm sure that's not what it is, but you have to admit, it is strange. It's weird to me that the police and the security officer couldn't find where these kids went after they left my apartment. Something that dawned on me after I had already moved out was something I had overlooked. There should have been no way for the kids to get inside the apartment building without a key. As I said before, there were no kids that lived in my specific building. So how did they get in? Where did they go? As time goes on and I reflect on this story, I get more freaked out. It's amazing to me that I wasn't more scared in the moment. I'm years removed and don't even live there anymore, and I'm more scared today writing this than I was when I experienced it. I still don't believe in ghosts or anything paranormal, but I can't explain exactly what it was. Neighborhood kids are the easy solution, but the more I replay the memories in my head, the more impossible that seems. I know how this story sounds, but I think it's worth sharing. Maybe I really did have an experience with something not from this world. This story I'm about to share happened to me around 10 years ago. It's without a doubt one of the most terrifying things that's ever happened to me. I recently stopped telling people this story because most of the time people tell me I'm lying or making it up. It was my wife who pushed me to write this down and share it. She said maybe somebody out there has gone through a similar experience, so here it is. Back then, I worked at a dead-end job. Just like most of us, it was a way to make ends meet. The mundane drag of retail work was beginning to drain the life from me. One afternoon, when I was leaving work, I noticed something neon pink hanging from my car door handle. It was a sticky note with a friendly message written. It simply said, "You're special, and I hope you have an amazing day." It also had a smiley face sticker attached to the note. I thought it was nice and it made me smile. Other than that, I didn't give it another thought at that moment. The next few days, when I left work, I would have a message attached to a note in the same spot. I know some people have told me that it's creepy and weird, but I liked the attention. At that point in my life, I wasn't getting attention very often, so it was nice to be seen. After 3 or 4 friendly messages, I decided I was going to leave a message on my door this time. When I parked for work that morning, I grabbed my own sticky notes and wrote a message. I kept things friendly, while also walking that line of being a little flirtatious. When I left work that afternoon, I was happy to find another note. The flirt worked because this person started flirting right back. I didn't know if this was a joke or if it was serious, but either way, I kept the charade going for a few days. The shift before I had a day off, I left a note saying something along the lines of, "Don't miss me too much on my day off." When I left work, I had a sticky note that just had a sad face drawn on it. This is where I thought the game would end for good. Somebody was having fun with me, I gave in, and now that I was going to be off, I figured it would just fizzle out. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I woke up the next day, I did some stuff around the house. It was late morning when I went outside for the first time. I noticed something neon pink on the car door again. I couldn't believe my eyes. I tentatively approached the note. It said, "You look cute when you're sleeping." This scared me. After a little while, I concluded that someone was messing with me. It clearly was someone I worked with who knew where I lived. It was the only thing that made sense to me. I crumpled the note up and threw it away. When I returned to work, the notes continued for a few days. They started friendly, but by the 3rd day of my not responding anymore, they started to get mean. The friendly messages were now saying things like, "You better answer me," and "Remember, I know where you live." I thought about calling the police, but I was still so sure that it was somebody I knew messing with me. I decided to leave a note the next morning. I wrote a message saying to leave me alone, or I would call the police. I didn't really have plans to call the police, but if it were really somebody I knew, I thought that this would be when they finally came forward, or at least stopped with the notes. When I left work that afternoon, I noticed that my note was gone, and for the first time in a while, I had no new notes on my door. I felt relieved. I still wanted to know who it was, but if the notes stopped, I was happy. That night, I woke up at some point in the middle of the night because I thought I heard something. Ever since the note outside, I was on edge. I sat in bed for a minute, just sitting silently, trying to listen. and I heard something again. It sounded a little like shuffling, but it was hard to tell if it was just the house making noises or if it was something more alarming. I assumed I was just hearing things, but I wasn't taking any chances. I grabbed a baseball bat and made my way down the long hallway from my bedroom to the open living room. Every step I took, I started thinking the worst. If a person were standing in my house, I don't think I would have been able to hit them with the bat I was holding. I just am not that type of person. I made it to the end of the hallway and just stopped. Whatever bravery I had when I left my room was gone. If you're standing at the end of the hall, you can see my living room, dining room, and kitchen. I turned on the dimmable lights and scanned the room from where I was standing. I was too scared to move any further. I kept imagining somebody hiding behind the couch or something. I stood in silence for a minute or so, and I heard nothing. I turned the lights off and briskly walked back to the bedroom. At any point, I expected somebody to charge after me, but thankfully that didn't happen. I locked my bedroom door and turned on the TV. I wanted to drown out the noise of nothingness. I ended up falling asleep eventually. When I woke up that morning, I almost forgot about how scared I was. I walked to the fridge to grab some juice, and that's when I saw it. A bright pink sticky note was stuck to the fridge that said, "You can't keep me away," with another smiley face attached after that statement. After being frozen for about 30 seconds, I ran to check every door and window in my house, and they all were still locked. I know for a fact that nobody had a key to my house. My family lives in another state, and I'm not close enough with anyone here to trust them with a key. Somehow, this person got inside my house and left a message on the fridge. I wasn't playing around anymore. I called the police and gave them the info. They claimed to have done an investigation, but they weren't able to get any useful information. Unfortunately, random notes were not a lot for them to go off of. At least that's what they said. They did try to check the cameras in the parking lot where I work, but where I park, the cameras don't reach. The employee parking spaces are on the side of the store, and there are no cameras there. The police concluded that it had to be someone who knew me. I would have agreed if it were not for the note inside my house. I'm a freak when it comes to locking my door, so I know that nobody had access to getting inside the house. I stayed at a friend's house for a couple nights just because I wasn't ready to sleep at my place yet. We ended up going to the hardware store and bought all new locks for the doors. That first night back at my place, my friend stayed over with me, and nothing happened that night. A few months had gone by, and nothing happened. No new notes at work, and nothing at my house. It was over 2 months later when I left for work one morning, and I noticed one of the horrible pink notes on my front door. I grabbed the note, and it said, "I guess you don't want to play anymore." I called the police right away, but they didn't do much. I invested in cameras after that, but nothing ever happened again. Changing the locks in my house might have saved my life. Somehow this person had to have had a key to my house. It's the only thing that makes sense to me. What I can't figure out is why me, and who was that person? Whenever I think back about that entire situation, I almost get sick. I think back to the night I heard something inside the house. There had to have been a person hiding somewhere, just inches or feet from where I was standing. Why didn't they harm me then? I wonder if messing around with me was all this person wanted. A friend once told me that when I went back to the room and locked the door, it's possible that this person tried to get into the room, but locking the door may have saved my life. It's been 10 years and nothing has happened since that last note. I've since moved and I'm married now. Every time I see those stupid pink sticky notes, I always think back to that horrible experience. Whatever the case may be, I'm just happy I'm still here to tell the story. I grew up in North Pennsylvania in a small town called Wellsboro. It's surrounded by state game land. I don't live there anymore, but hunting season was a big deal there. Schools would even close on the first day of rifle season because half the town would be out in the woods. My dad got me into hunting when I was about 12, and by the time I was 23, I was going out alone regularly. This happened during the late archery season in November of 2021. I remember because there was already a light dusting of snow on the ground, which made it easier to track movement. I had permission to hunt a large piece of private land owned by an older guy my dad knew from work. The property was around 70 acres of thick woods with a small clearing and an old logging trail running through it. There was also an abandoned hunting cabin way back in the woods that nobody used anymore because the roof was starting to cave in. I had been there maybe 4 or 5 times before and never saw anyone else. That morning, I got there around 5:15 a.m. while it was still completely dark. I parked my truck where I always did near a rusted gate and walked in with my headlamp on. The woods were dead quiet. I remember having this weird feeling like I was being watched before I even got to the stand, but I just blamed it on being alone in the dark like always. I climbed into my tree stand about 20 feet up and waited for daylight. About an hour after sunrise, I noticed something that immediately bothered me. About 60 yards out, I saw another tree stand that had not been there before. I knew the property pretty well, and I was certain it had not been there the previous weekend. It was one of those cheap ladder stands, and it looked old and weathered, like it had been sitting somewhere for years, but I would have noticed it before. What bothered me more was that there were no footprints leading to it in the snow, except for one single trail of prints that went from deep in the woods straight to the base of the stand. I watched it for a while, thinking maybe someone else had permission to hunt there and just never mentioned it. Around 8 a.m., I saw movement near that stand. At first, thinking it was a deer, I was dead wrong when I saw it was a person standing behind a tree. He wasn't in camo. He was wearing a dirty gray hoodie and dark pants. He was still, and he was looking in my direction. I didn't know if he saw me at first, but then he slowly raised his arm and waved. I wouldn't say it was a friendly, smiley wave, more so a wave like he was just letting me know he saw me. I gave a small wave back, thinking maybe he was just another hunter who didn't have proper gear. After maybe a minute, he stepped behind the tree, and I expected him to walk away, but he didn't come out the other side. I waited and waited, but he never reappeared. I assumed he must have walked deeper into the woods, but I never heard footsteps. Around 10, I climbed down to stretch my legs and maybe still hunt a little. I walked toward where I saw him. When I got to the tree he had been standing behind, I saw that the snow around the tree was completely undisturbed except for my own tracks walking in. There were no tracks leading away, just the same single line of footprints I saw earlier leading toward the ladder stand. I followed those prints, and they stopped right at the base of the stand. I looked up, expecting maybe he climbed it, but it was empty. The seat had a thin layer of snow on it that didn't look disturbed. That made no sense. I remember feeling my chest get tight, like something was very wrong. I decided to head back toward my own stand. On the way back, I noticed something tied to a branch at about eye level. It was a strip of orange hunting vest material tied in a knot. I was thinking maybe someone marked a trail. But then I saw another one about 15 feet away, and then another. They were tied at different heights, like someone had been marking something pretty specifically. That was the first time I considered just leaving. Around noon, I went back to my truck to eat and warm up. Nothing happened during that time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. I almost left, but I convinced myself I was just overthinking things. I went back in around 2 p.m. to sit until dark. This is where things got bad. About an hour before sunset, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps behind me in the leaves. Too heavy and spaced out to be an animal. I turned to face them, expecting to see another hunter. About 30 yards behind my stand, I saw the same guy from earlier. This time he was closer, and I could see his face better. His beard looked patchy and dirty, and his skin looked pale like he hadn't been outside in daylight in weeks. What really bothered me was that he was smiling, but not in a normal way. He was just barely showing his teeth. He was holding something in his right hand, which at first I thought was a stick, until seeing the little yellow and black handle. It was a screwdriver. He didn't say anything. He chose to just stare me down with that half smile. I asked if he had permission to be on the property, but he didn't answer. After maybe 10 seconds of this heart-pounding stare-off, he slowly turned and walked away into the trees. That should have been the moment I left. However, I made the stupid decision to stay until shooting light ended. Right after sunset, I climbed down and started walking back fast. In that moment, I remember regretting not leaving while I still had some light in the sky. About halfway to my truck, I started noticing the orange cloth strips again, but this time they weren't just on branches. Some were tied to small sticks pushed into the ground, But the thing that genuinely scared me was one of the sticks had something hanging from it. It was a dead squirrel. It had been hung by a wire through its back legs. I may be a hunter, but I don't condone needless suffering of animals. Under the squirrel and stick, in the snow, someone had drawn a rough circle with a boot. That was the second time I seriously considered running. As I kept walking, I started noticing more of them. Not just squirrels, a rabbit, a crow, all hung the same way like markers, or maybe a threat. I started walking faster. About 100 yards from my truck, I saw something leaning against a tree that made me stop completely. It was my backpack, the one I had left in my tree stand earlier that day. I never brought it back down with me. It was zipped open, and my stuff was laid out in the snow, including my knife, my flashlight, and my extra arrows. They were all lined up neatly, like someone had taken inventory. That was the moment of realization that someone had been close enough to my stand to climb it without me knowing. I grabbed my stuff fast and jogged the rest of the way. When I got to the clearing where my truck was, I had another unexpected encounter. It was like it just didn't stop. My driver's side door was open. I know I locked it because I always do. Nothing inside looked stolen, but my registration papers were sitting on the passenger seat instead of the glove box. I got in and locked the doors, and as I started the truck, I looked in the mirror toward the tree line. There he was, standing just inside the woods, maybe 40 yards away, the guy in the hoodie. From what I could tell, he was still smiling. This time he raised his hand again, but instead of waving, he just pointed at me. Then he slowly dragged his finger across his own throat. I left so fast I spun gravel all the way back to the main road. I told the property owner what happened, and he said nobody else had permission to be there. He contacted the game commission. About 2 weeks later, he called my dad and said officers found a makeshift shelter deep on the property made from tarps and old wood. Inside, they found animal bones and stolen hunting gear from other properties. I never hunted there again. I don't hunt alone anymore either. Definitely not in grounds I'm not familiar with. Anything can happen when you're all alone out there. Yet, not actually alone. This story takes place in November of last year when I was on a hunting trip with my grandpa to Crockett, Texas. I don't really get to see my grandpa that often because he owns his own company, so when he told me he wanted to go hunting, I was more than happy to go. I will say, I personally don't like hunting, but I love to camp, and I had never been to this particular lease he was taking us to, so I figured why not? I love exploring new places. So I took a few days off from work and went down to Crockett with him. As we pulled up to the gate, I noticed there wasn't a real entryway like most places I've been to. It was just a dirt track with an iron gate on the side of a freeway. My grandpa got out of the truck to lift the gate, and then we headed down a long dirt road through the woods until we reached a clearing with an old house in the middle. While we were heading toward the house, he told me his father built it and they used it to go hunting or just relax and take a break from life. I could definitely see that. It was so peaceful inside the woods I could barely hear the cars from the freeway. It seemed like the perfect getaway for the weekend, or so I thought. After we pulled into the driveway, we unpacked the truck and cooked dinner for the night. Everything seemed normal. There were old beds where we put sheets and blankets, an old TV with a VCR, and the stove was particularly old-fashioned as well. After we finished eating, we went to sleep around 8:30 so we could wake up just before dawn to go to one of the blinds. As I started to fall asleep, I heard a scratching noise coming from one of the windows with the screen on it. I didn't think anything of it and fell asleep fairly soon after that. The next morning, my grandpa woke me up to get dressed so we could go to the blind. After we got there, we settled in and surveyed the clearing. We didn't see anything for a couple hours, so we decided to take a nap. I woke up after only being asleep a few minutes and took my binoculars to look at the tree line. The tree line was about 1.5 miles from the blind. I swear to God, I spotted someone peeking around the trees right at the edge of the woods, like they knew we were there. It was almost as if they had been watching us the whole time. I was thoroughly convinced someone was watching us, so I woke up my grandpa. He looked through his binoculars, and right then, a herd of deer came out into the clearing. He just chuckled and told me there was nothing to worry about and that it was just wildlife. I was irritated to say the least. I know what I saw, and and it looked like someone, or at least something. After about 30 minutes, he shot one of the deer, and we took it back to the house to clean it and start skinning it. After we gutted the deer, it was about 3 o'clock, and we decided what we wanted for dinner, but we needed to head into town to get some supplies. So we hung the deer up and left for the store. When we got back, we saw claw and bite marks all over the animal's body. My grandpa and I just looked at each other in shock. He looked at me and said we were going on a night hunt. I asked him what for, and he told me he thought it was coyotes, but I didn't think that was the case. This didn't seem normal. After we ate, we grabbed some flashlights and our ARs and went out scouting. We were talking for a solid 45 minutes before we heard anything. We got really close to the tree line, and I suddenly turned and saw something peeking out at us again. The second it realized I noticed it, it quickly hid. I tried everything in my power not to yell for my grandpa, so I did a light whistle to him and waved him over to where I saw it. He whispered for me to stay put and watch his back. He walked into the woods with his gun raised and disappeared. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting to hear something. After about 10 minutes, I heard a gunshot. I ran into the woods and saw a coyote with a mutilated deer next to it. I breathed a sigh of relief seeing my grandpa okay, but he told me the coyote noticed him and looked like it was about to attack, so he had no choice. We sat there for a moment before we heard rustling in the distance, followed by the most horrifying scream I've ever heard. It wasn't human, and it was definitely not any animal I recognized, but I didn't care to find out. We booked it back to the house as fast as we could while hearing intense heavy footsteps and heavy breathing coming from behind us. It felt like we would never make it back, but we did. We slammed the door shut and locked every entrance. All we heard were weird screeching sounds and breathing right outside the door. Whatever it was began to get frustrated and slammed against the door a couple times. My grandpa got tired of being scared and shot through the door a couple times. It must have hurt whatever was on the other side, because it made that terrifying screech again and then ran away. As soon as we could catch our breath, I called the police and told them what happened. They were obviously skeptical of the story, but when the deputy arrived, he didn't know what to think either. We showed him everything we found. He seemed pretty unsettled by it too. Nothing ever came back from that call, but needless to say, we probably won't ever be going back to that house again. Kyle had been asking Connor and I for 2 years to go hunting with him, and we always brushed it off because neither of us really knew what we were doing, and hunting was never something I was interested in. Kyle was the kind of guy who actually knew how to do things though. He knew how to gut a deer, split wood, start a fire without lighter fluid, and somehow look comfortable sleeping on the ground. Connor and I were not those kinds of guys. We liked the idea of a hunting trip more than the reality of it. Sitting around drinking in the mountains for a weekend sounded good. Hiking miles into the woods, waking up before sunrise, and killing an animal did not. But Kyle finally talked us into it late one November. He said rifle season was open and the weather would be cold enough to keep the bugs down. He knew a spot in the mountains where he had hunted before and almost never saw anyone else. I'm being honest, he mainly convinced us with the food and beer part in the middle of the mountains. The plan was this. We would drive up Friday morning, hike in, set up camp, and spend the weekend hunting. I'm not a hunter, so I'll do my best to use hunting terms and whatever. Connor agreed to the trip because he would agree to almost anything if it sounded like a good story later. I agreed because I didn't want to be the only one still saying no, and FOMO is strong with me sometimes. We loaded Kyle's truck before sunrise and drove a few hours into the mountains. Kyle kept talking us through everything like we were in some beginner class. He showed us how to keep the rifles pointed safe, how to walk without making as much noise, what deer sign looked like, and how to spot little trails through thick woods that I never would have noticed on my own. After parking the truck at a pull-off near an old logging road, we hiked in for an annoying amount of time. Kyle said it was only a few miles. It felt like 10. By the time we got to the area he wanted, my shoulders were sore and my legs were shaking on the steeper parts. We found a flat spot near a small creek and set up camp there. Kyle did most of the work because Connor and I were honestly useless. By the time it got dark, we had the tents up, a fire going, and a little ring of logs pulled around it to sit on. That first night actually felt perfect for a while. The woods were dead quiet except for the fire popping and the creek moving over the rocks. We were drinking beers, talking about old high school stuff, and making fun of how bad Connor was at putting up a 10. It was a rare, honestly amazing moment. I remember thinking I understood why people liked this. Then, out of the blue, we heard a scream somewhere deep in the woods. We all stopped talking at once. Kyle tilted his head and listened like a dog, while Connor laughed a little and said it sounded like a woman getting murdered. Kyle said it could be a fox. He said foxes can make sounds that sound like a screaming woman. I wanted the fox thing to be true, because that scream didn't sound like a fox to me. Because it was so far away, it was easy to tell ourselves it was an animal. After about a minute or two, we started talking again, though not as relaxed as before. Every one of us kept pausing to listen, even Kyle. About 5 minutes later, the scream came again. However, this time, it was so much closer that the conversation died instantly. It sounded like it came from maybe a football field away, if that. It was loud enough that there was no joking around after that one. It sounded exactly like a woman screaming. One long scream that ended all at once. Connor stood up and stared into the dark beyond the firelight. Kyle got to his feet too. Then Connor called out, asking if someone needed help out there. I said that was a stupid thing to do, and then we all just stared into the woods and listened for an answer. Nothing came back. Kyle looked uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen yet. He said if it was a person, they probably would have answered. Then he said we needed to kill the fire and get into the tents. He didn't say why, but it was obvious. The fire was basically a marker showing exactly where we were. We put the fire out fast and climbed into our tents with our rifles nearby. I barely slept that night. Every little noise my brain picked up on. At some point, I must have passed out anyway, because when I woke up, it was gray outside and cold enough that I didn't want to leave the sleeping bag. But when the urge to pee got too bad, I finally stepped out of the tent. Right away though, I noticed our chairs were tipped over, and one of the coolers had been turned sideways. A grocery bag with snacks in it was torn open and dragged a few feet. Kyle's backpack was lying near the fire ring when it had definitely been against a tree when we went to bed. I called for Kyle and Connor, and they both came out half awake. Kyle looked around and immediately said a bear had probably come through. That made sense. It was the easiest explanation. We hadn't hung everything properly, and there had been food smells all over camp. The weird thing was that not much was actually gone. Stuff was moved around more than it was eaten or stolen. Still, Kyle sounded confident, and I wanted a normal explanation badly enough to accept it. He said we should move camp deeper into the woods, both because of the bear and because he wanted to get closer to the area he planned to hunt that day. So we packed up and moved. The second site was farther from the creek and on a thicker patch of woods along a slope. It somehow felt a lot more isolated, even though it probably wasn't that much farther in. We hunted most of that day. Kyle split us up, but kept us within sight at first, showing us where to sit and how to watch the tree lines and openings. Connor treated the whole thing like a game at first, but by mid-afternoon, even he had settled down. There's something about sitting in the woods for hours with a rifle that changes your mood, whether you want it to or not. Late in the day, Kyle shot a deer. It happened fast. I only heard the crack of the rifle and then Kyle yelling for us. When Connor and I got to him, the deer was down in a patch of brush about 40 yards away. It was a decent-sized buck. Seeing a dead deer up close was different than seeing one in a photo. Kyle had us drag it back to camp, which was miserable work. Once we got there, he started field dressing it and then showed us how to skin and break it down. Connor acted interested, but I could tell he was forcing it. I just felt sick. The smell was awful, and the whole thing felt brutal. Side note, I grew up an animal lover because of my parents, so the idea of me going on a hunting trip was already kinda crazy. Kyle was in his element though. He explained every part of it like he was teaching a class, and by the end, there were chunks of meat bagged in the cooler and a bloody mess off to the side that I tried not to look at. That night, we drank again, partly to celebrate, and partly because I think Connor and I needed it after helping with the deer. Kyle cut off some backstrap and cooked it over the fire. That wasn't our originally planned dinner. It was just a celebratory meal, if you'd call it that. I have to admit, it tasted good. As a surprisingly good day was coming to a fun close, the scream came back. It was distant at first, maybe even farther than that first scream the night before, but the second I heard it, I felt an uncomfortable feeling inside me. Like, this again? We all knew that sound now. Nobody said fox this time. Nobody laughed. Kyle stared off into the dark. Connor muttered that there was no way this was happening again. We waited and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few minutes later, the scream came again, much closer, and this time it sounded like it was moving toward us the way it had the first night. It was fully dark by then, and the firelight made everything beyond it look even blacker. I remember the feeling that whoever was making that sound could probably see us perfectly, even though we couldn't see anything at all past the trees, and that made me uncomfortable. Kyle stood up and grabbed his rifle. He was trying to act calm, but I could hear it in his voice that he cursed under his breath. Then, in this weird burst of drunk confidence, he raised the rifle and fired a few rounds into the air. Right after that, he started yelling into the woods like a maniac, trying to sound bigger and crazier than whoever was out there. Connor and I laughed, mostly because it was sudden and ridiculous, and I think because all three of us had been drinking enough that our nerves were mixed with stupid energy. But the laughter didn't last, because a moment later, the scream came again, even closer. Close enough that it sounded like it was just a few yards outside of the edge of camp, somewhere beyond the trees where the firelight stopped. Kyle stopped yelling right away. None of us said it, but I think we all realized that if it was a person, the warning shots had not scared them off. We put the fire out again, faster than the night before. Within seconds, the site was pitch black. The only light left was a weak little glow from the coals and some moonlight through the trees. We got into our tents with our rifles. I lay there wide awake, of course. I could hear little sounds from the woods, branches shifting and leaves crunching, but I couldn't tell what was real and what my mind was inventing. Then I heard footsteps, not walking, but running, fast and hard around the tents and through the campsite. Something brushed the side of my tent, like a dragging scratch, like someone running an object along the fabric as they moved past. I didn't call out for Connor or Kyle because I was terrified that it wasn't them. All I'd be doing was getting the attention of whoever was out there. Then it went completely still for the last time. That silence was the worst part. Maybe a full minute passed before that scream exploded right in the middle of the campsite. It was so loud that it didn't sound human anymore in a normal sense. I heard Connor scream from his tent. I yelled too without meaning to. Then Kyle fired a shot through the roof of his tent into the air. The blast was deafening. Right after it, I heard fast footsteps tearing off through the woods. All these sounds were so amplified, it felt like so much was going on. The footsteps got farther and farther away until I couldn't hear a thing. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Kyle shouted, asking if we were okay. Connor answered immediately in the shaky voice I had never heard from him before. I answered too. Kyle said we were all getting into one tent and that there was no way we were staying in separate tents after that. We crawled into his tent because it was the biggest. The three of us sat there with rifles and flashlights, barely talking. At one point, Connor asked what the hell that was, and Kyle just said he didn't know flat out. Hours passed like that. Every so often, one of us would think we heard movement and everyone would go silent again. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off enough that we all drifted off at some point. When morning came, nothing looked as bad as I expected. A couple things were knocked over outside. One of the beer cans had been stepped on. A plastic tub had been moved a few feet, but nothing was stolen. We packed up at dawn without even discussing hunting again. Nobody wanted to stay another night. We hiked back the way we came, talking more as we got closer to the truck, probably because being in motion made us feel less trapped. By the time we were on the road again, some of the fear had turned into that weird laughter people have after something bad. Connor kept doing an impression of Kyle screaming into the woods and firing into the air, like one of the Tatooine warriors from Star Wars. Even Kyle laughed. We talked about whether we should call the sheriff and report it. In the end, we didn't. Kyle said if it was really someone needing help, they would have answered us either night when we yelled back. Connor said it was probably some lunatic messing with hunters. I said it was maybe a woman on drugs or someone trying to lure people into the dark. Both of our explanations were scary, and they felt like the easy assumptions. Truth be told, who the actual knows what the explanation could have been. I got home that night exhausted and thought I would sleep good, but I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat from a dream. In the dream, I was back in the woods alone, and I could see a woman standing between the trees. She was covered in blood, and she was screaming for help. and the way she looked right at me gave me chills, even now. But I couldn't move toward her. I just stood there while she screamed and screamed until I woke up. I sat on the edge of my bed breathing hard, thinking about those 2 nights in the mountains and wondering what that dream was about, if it was my brain telling me that I subconsciously felt guilty. What sticks with me most now is the possibility that somewhere in all of that, there really had been a person out there and we chose to hide from her. I still tell myself that if someone had truly needed help, they would have answered us. They would have come closer to the fire and said something. All 3 of us wonder if someone really needed help that night, or if something darker was going on. One of the benefits of my job is that I get to travel all around the world. It's taken me to some amazing destinations like Greece and Italy, although most of the time I stay within the US. A few years ago, my job took me to a mountainous region in the northeastern United States called the Adirondacks. If anyone's familiar with the area, you know what I'm talking about when I say it's beautiful in the fall. The leaves change and it makes the mountains look like you're in a fairy tale or something. It's incredible. Usually, my job pays for a hotel, but this time I wanted to spend some much-needed alone time in the mountains. So I went through Airbnb to find a secluded mountain home for the weekend. I found a beautiful home that was nestled in the trees and had an incredible view that looked down part of a mountain from the back deck. This place was exactly what I was looking for. There were a few trails right by the house that I could jog on in the morning, and as I said, the back deck had an amazing view that I could just sit and relax and take in all the scenic beauty. For privacy reasons, I'm not going to reveal the name of the woman who posted the property on Airbnb. My work obligations were only in the late afternoon and early evening, so I could spend most of my time at the house. I got to the house later on Friday, and I didn't do much except have a few drinks on the deck. I called it an early night. I woke up around 6 a.m. on Saturday and went for a jog on the trails that surround the house. You know that horrible feeling that you have when you're being watched? Well, I had that feeling for my entire jog. I blamed it on the anxiety of just being alone in the wilderness, since I'm technically a city person. After my jog, I took a shower and just hung out around the house for a few hours. I kept hearing weird noises, but once again, I just kept telling myself that it's my anxiety. I was in a wooden cabin up in the mountains. Of course, there were going to be all sorts of noises. I left the house a little after 3:30 in the afternoon and made my way into the town. I met my coworkers at a local restaurant, and we took care of our business. After all of that, we decided to go out for a few drinks. I didn't want to admit it to myself or anyone else, but I was freaked out to go back to the house. I don't know if it was the feeling of being watched and all the strange noises, or if the remote location was just a little too remote for me. Whatever it was, I was happy to take my time getting back. I even offered to have a little after party at the house, but my coworkers decided to turn in a little before 10 p.m. I put the fear beside me and made my way back to the house. I spent the entire drive trying to communicate with the irrational part of my brain that was freaked out. I repeated to myself over and over again that it's just a house, houses make noises, and I'm safe. I'll lock the doors and triple check that I've locked them before I go to bed. I got back to the house at about 10:45. I was relieved how tired I was. Even with all my nerves, I was confident I could fall asleep. I did indeed check all the locks 3 times and then tried to go to bed. I spent the next few hours tossing and turning. I would drift away for a little bit and then hear something outside and be wide awake for 20 minutes. I tried turning on some music with my phone to drown out some of the noise, but the distraction of the music was keeping me awake. It was only a matter of time before I started hearing the noise again, even with the music playing. It was a little after midnight when I decided to go smoke a cigarette and contemplate just leaving early since I was already wide awake. I grabbed my coat, my phone, and my cigs and made my way downstairs. The stairs came out into the living room, and if you turned left at the bottom of the stairs, you would see a large open room that served as a dining room and a kitchen. The back of the room had a sliding door that led to the back deck, which was my current destination. I took one step into the dark room, and I thought I could see a shadow in the kitchen that was causing some of the moonlight from the window to be obstructed. I felt that horrible pit in my stomach turn into a cyclone as I just stood there. I kept telling myself that it was just shadows and it was nothing to fear. I decided to confront my fear and turn the light on, and the image of what I saw is still burned into my brain and is one of the scariest images I've ever seen. Standing in the kitchen, clear as day, was a man. He was probably 6 feet tall with long, shaggy hair and a thick beard. I would say he was late 30s if I had to guess. There was a brief standoff where neither one of us did or said anything. It couldn't have been longer than 10 or 15 seconds, but that specific moment felt like it lasted hours. He was hunched over a bit and just staring at me. With no notice, the man lunged at me with a full sprint. Thankfully, there was a counter in the middle of the kitchen, so he had to go around the counter, which gave me the time to run back to my room and lock the door. I realized that this is what stupid people do in horror movies, but at that moment, it seemed like the best possible solution. For starters, I didn't think I could make it to the front or back door without getting caught first, and if I was able to escape, I didn't have my keys, and I didn't know if this man had a weapon or something, so I wasn't about to just run aimlessly into the woods. My room seemed like the safest place because I could lock the door, call 911, and just hope that the door's integrity would last until the police showed up. So that's just what I did. I locked the door, ran to the closet, and called the police. I told them the address and to hurry. The woman from this dispatch stayed on the line and told me that someone would be there soon. While I was waiting, the man started to beat on the door. They seemed like violent strikes on the wood of the door. After each strike, he would say the weirdest things, like he kept saying that he loves me and that he's changed. I got a good look at this man in the kitchen, and I knew without a doubt that I had no idea who this guy was. I started yelling back to the man that I didn't know him and that he had the wrong woman, but it was like he couldn't hear me. He just kept yelling about how much he loved me and that he needed me back. I could hear the door starting to break. When I looked, I could see his fist starting to penetrate the wood of the door from him striking it repeatedly. I'm so grateful that I heard sirens at this point. I heard several cars pull in, and they came at the perfect time. Just as the man was able to get his entire hand through the door, I heard a loud crash accompanied by the sound of the police yelling at the man. At the same time, I decided to jump out of the bedroom window since it led to a small roof that I figured I could try to scale down. The crash I had heard right before was the police tackling the man to the ground just as he was about to get into the bedroom. I flagged one of the officers from the roof, and he helped me get down. The police arrested the man, and he continued yelling incoherently as they put him in the back of a squad car. They called the owner of the house, and that's when we finally started to get a few answers. This guy was the ex-fiancé of the woman who owns the house. Apparently, the guy had gone off the grid for a while after a bad breakup. The most disturbing part of all of this was the guy had been living in one of the closets of the house for a few days. Inside the closet, they found a bunch of beer cans and snack foods. I don't know why he didn't act sooner, but I'm so thankful he didn't, because this could have ended a lot worse for me. If I hadn't decided to get up for a smoke at that moment, this story could have had a much more tragic ending. The police told me that he had a knife from the kitchen inside his belt loop. It made me think to myself, I probably caught him in the act of getting the knife. The owner of the house felt horrible, and last I knew, the man was going to jail, but who knows. It's just so scary for me to think that I checked the lock 3 times, and it didn't even matter because this creep was already in the house. I guess you never know what can happen. This may be the only time in history that going outside for a smoke saved a life. Okay, so this is a weird story. I was freaked out in the moment, but for a while, I thought maybe I was just overreacting. It was almost 2 years ago, and I interviewed for a job that was in another state. It was about a 5-hour drive. Instead of driving home after the interview, my soon-to-be wife suggested that I find an Airbnb to stay at for the night. I'm hopeless when it comes to apps like this, and I have no idea how to find a good place. She downloaded the app for me, found a place that looked nice, and it was only about a 10-minute drive from where the interview was being held. I booked the spot and got myself ready for the interview. The guy who owned the house was really nice. I was messaging him about why I was coming down, and he told me that if I wanted to, I could get into the house early that day so I could get myself ready and prepared for the interview, instead of driving for 5 hours and then going straight into the interview. I thought that was really nice. The owner sent me the code to get in and gave me all the instructions on how to lock the door. Well, it's literally one button, but still good to know since I had never used one of those keypad locks before this. My interview was at 3. I had more than enough time to shower and get myself mentally prepared for the interview. When I plugged in the interview address into the GPS, it said 9 minutes, so I planned on giving myself at least 30 minutes in case I got lost or hit traffic. After the interview, I grabbed some tacos and went back to the house. I thought the interview went well, but of course, I spent the next few hours second-guessing every answer I gave. I tend to do that when I'm nervous. I didn't do much of anything that night except eat, talk to my girl on the phone, and watch a movie. I know all these places are cleaned, but I still find it weird to sleep in someone else's bed. I'm just weird like that. It's why I don't travel a lot or go on vacation. I planned on sleeping on the couch and heading out first thing in the morning. The living room was cozy. It had a big, fluffy wraparound couch that was in front of a fireplace. Above the fireplace was a huge TV. Just to sweeten the deal, the room also had surround sound. I was perfectly content just staying in this room all night and watching movies until I dozed off and went to bed. Around 11 that night, I grabbed a blanket from one of the beds and I threw on Avengers Endgame. I was only about 15 minutes into the movie when I started to fall asleep. That sleep didn't last very long, as I was awoken by the sound of the doorbell. I just laid there for a few minutes and looked around. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if it was the movie or something. Then a few seconds later, the doorbell chimed again. I couldn't believe it. The doorbell was actually ringing. I grabbed my phone and saw that the time said 11:33. I couldn't imagine who would be ringing the doorbell at this hour. My first thought was just to ignore it. Then the bell rang again. Every time it rang, it made my heart basically jump out of my chest. At the fourth ring, I decided I was going to go check it out. I was thinking to myself, what if it were like the police or something? I cautiously made my way to the door, and before opening it, I looked out the front windows that gave me a somewhat view of the person. It was a skinny guy, and he was holding up a small brown bag in his hands. He had his head down and almost looked unresponsive. I went to the door and opened it, but left the screen door shut and locked. The light was dim, so I couldn't get a decent look at the guy. With his head still down, he told me he had my pizza delivery. Clearly, he wasn't holding a pizza. It was a brown paper bag. I politely told him I didn't order a pizza and that he had the wrong address. I shut the door and started heading back to the living room. The doorbell rang again. I marched back to the front door and opened it. Before I could yell go away or anything, he just told me again in a bleak and monotone voice that he had my pizza. When I shouted I didn't order a pizza, the guy responded by giving me the address of the house and said the delivery was for this address. I started to shout that it was a mistake and I didn't order pizza, and while I was shouting, I noticed that the guy was grabbing the screen door handle. I know I should have been more freaked out, but I was just annoyed. I slammed the door after yelling at him to go away before I called the police. After I slammed the door, I snuck back to the front window and again crouched down to look at what this guy was doing. He stood there for another minute and walked away. He had a beat-up red sedan of some kind. I couldn't tell what the make was. One of the front headlights was busted. Once I saw him get into the car, I felt a moment of relief. After that ordeal, I was ironically hungry. I grabbed something from the kitchen, and as I was walking back to the living room, I saw lights still shining through the front windows. When I looked outside, this guy was still sitting in the driveway with his one high beam shining through the window. I decided to go upstairs and look out one of the bedroom windows since I would have a much better vantage point. Because the light was so bright, I couldn't see him sitting in the car, but I could see that the car was running. I was still more annoyed than anything else. My two thoughts were either calling the police or going outside and telling this guy to hit the road. I decided that I didn't want to bother the police with something that could be very small and maybe nothing, so instead I'll just go outside and scare the guy into leaving. I threw my shoes on and marched out there like I was an Avenger. When I got to the window of the car, nobody was there. Without thinking, I turned around and ran back to the house, and immediately I locked the door. I even locked the chain on top of the door. I was trying to ask myself why he wouldn't be in the car, but the car was still running. It didn't make sense to me. I grabbed my phone and went upstairs into the bedroom. I tried texting the owner of the house, but I didn't receive a message back from him right away. I continued to look out of the window for several minutes. I contemplated calling the police, but I kept telling myself that this isn't police-worthy and I'm blowing all of this out of proportion. A few minutes later, I looked out the window, and I saw the skinny man get back into his car, and it almost looked like he was coming from the direction of the front door. I watched him finally back out of the driveway, and he appeared to drive down the street and out of sight. I wasn't scared, but I was so on edge that I didn't really sleep. I spent the entire night watching YouTube videos while lying on the floor of the bedroom. At 4 in the morning, I decided to officially get up, shower, and then leave. As I was gathering my things and getting ready to walk out the door, I noticed something horrible. The front door was unlocked and ajar. Because the chain was locked, it wouldn't open any further. I just stood in amazement. I couldn't remember if maybe I left it unlocked by accident after the last incident. I was sure I locked it, but I didn't want to think about the potential alternative. Then it dawned on me that I for sure didn't lock the screen door when I ran inside. As the sun was rising, I made a run for my car just in case, and as I was backing out of the driveway, I noticed on the side of the front porch was the brown paper bag. I ran outside so fast that I didn't even notice it initially. I thought about going to see if anything was inside, but that was a question that, in that moment, I didn't want answered. I drove away, and at the end of the street was a disgusting green house, and in the driveway was an ugly red car with what looked like a broken headlight. It may be a coincidence, but it looked exactly like the car that sat in the driveway the previous night. The owner of the Airbnb messaged me that morning to apologize for missing my message last night and asked how the stay was. I told him about the delivery driver, the car in the driveway, the unlocked door in the morning, and the similar looking red car at the end of the street. He started typing because I could see the dots in the message, and then he never responded after that. I never bothered to look more into the situation until I started telling people the story. When I looked up the house more recently, it's not listed on Airbnb anymore, so I don't know what to think. It was unnerving and a little freaky for sure, but I truly wasn't that scared. I'm more scared now when I think about it because other people seem to think that this was almost some kind of setup. I'm curious to see what people think, if it all could have been just a crazy string of coincidences, or if I was almost a victim of something sinister. Let me start by saying that monsters exist in this world, and they're not ghosts or demons, but very real people who mean you harm. My family still hasn't recovered from the terror we experienced last summer, and I'm worried they may never fully heal. I'll start at the beginning and do my best to tell the story. My wife and I decided to take the kids on a small family vacation. Nothing crazy, just a few nights away at the ocean. I was surprised to see that finding houses on Airbnb was cheaper than the hotels that were available. My wife found this awesome place that wasn't right on the ocean, but it was only a 5-minute walk, and it was way cheaper than staying on the ocean. The house was directly at the back of a dead-end street, and behind the house was a creek, so it felt very private, which was cool. We got to the beach town in the mid-afternoon, and we spent several hours at the beach before heading to the house. My son was 8, and my daughter was 13, and usually they fight constantly, but something about being at the ocean caused them to play together like good siblings. This would probably be the highlight of the trip, because things started going downhill after that. We got to the house at 5 and unpacked our bags. The kiddos claimed their rooms, and we all got cleaned up from the beach. My wife brought a bunch of meals to cook instead of us having to go out every night. She loves to cook, which I love. There really is nothing better than a home-cooked meal. The deal is, she cooks and I do the dishes. It seems like a fair trade-off. That night, we stayed up for a few hours and played Uno, and then we eventually went to bed. I slept like a baby that night. I wish I could have said the same thing about my son. The next morning, he looked exhausted at breakfast. The poor kid barely touched his food. When I asked him what was wrong, he just put his head down and didn't say anything. He almost looked embarrassed. After a little bit of prying, he finally caved in and told me what was wrong. He claimed that he saw ghosts the previous night. Yes, you heard me correctly. My 8-year-old son claimed to have seen ghosts. When I asked him to explain more, he told me that he saw the shadows move around in the backyard. He looked out the window and saw several shadows come up to the house and disappear for a while, then eventually go back into the tree line, which was right before the creek. He said one of the shadows even turned around at one point and waved at him. The poor kid was in tears while he was telling me. Whatever he saw, or whatever he thought he saw, it clearly freaked him out. My wife and I, and even my daughter, were giving him the ghosts aren't real talk. It took a little while, but he finally started acting like himself again. We went to the beach that day and had another fun day together, hitting waves and building sandcastles. When we got back to the house, I noticed that the door wasn't locked. I asked my wife if she had locked it, and she wasn't sure. I'm compulsive about locking the door, and unfortunately, she isn't. I would have been more annoyed, but anything of value that we had was with me, and after a little walk around the house, nothing looked out of place. Another evening of cooking and card games, and then the kids went to bed around 10 p.m. My wife and I stayed up for a little bit longer and had a few drinks. I didn't look at the exact time, but I would say it was nearly midnight when my son knocked on our bedroom door. He could barely talk, and the poor kid was trembling. He said the ghosts are back, and they're in the backyard again. I sprang up and looked out all the windows, and I didn't see anything. I kept asking him to point them out, but he was too scared to even look out the window. The only thing that was admittedly a little weird was that the backyard floodlight was on, but that could have been set off by anything like the wind or even an animal. I spent the next few minutes trying to comfort him and tell him everything was okay. When he finally spoke, he barely got the words out. He said one of the ghosts tapped on his window. He told him that if he screamed, he would hurt his entire family. According to my son, he asked the ghost to leave him alone, and apparently, the ghost said he'd leave him alone if he opened the door. Instead of opening the door, my son came to wake us up. I was scared, but not because I thought ghosts were real, rather because something was clearly terrifying my poor son. I was thinking maybe my daughter showed him a movie or something that he wasn't supposed to see, or maybe he was just homesick, since he hadn't traveled much as a family. That night, he slept with us, and I didn't sleep very well because I could feel him shaking all night. The kid was truly scared out of his mind. At breakfast, it was the same as the day before. He barely touched his food, and he looked like he was about to collapse into his scrambled eggs. I pitched an idea to him and the rest of the family. I proposed that we have a campout in the living room. We can make a fort and we'll all sleep together. It'll be like a family sleepover or something. The kids loved it, especially my son. If he was going to see the ghosts tonight, at least I'd be there with him. We played games for a while, but eventually we all fell asleep. At 2:30 in the morning, my son was shaking me awake and said that the ghosts were outside. I got up expecting to see nothing, and I couldn't be more wrong. At the sliding door were 3 hooded figures wearing these creepy black masks with these bulging white eyes. They almost looked like golf balls. I shouted some kind of nonsense out of fear, and that woke up my wife and daughter. As soon as they saw the masked figures, they started to scream and shout. During all the commotion, I saw one figure trying to open the sliding door, but thankfully it was locked. My daughter, thinking quickly on her feet, called 911. I grabbed a big walking stick that was inside the house and approached the door. I realized that if they had real weapons, the walking stick would be useless, but I was in fight or flight mode and I had to protect my family. I started yelling at them to leave my family alone, and they looked like they were taunting me, almost like they were enjoying the mental pain they were putting my family through. The person on the left side of the door pulled out what looked like a knife and started waving it back and forth. My family was in tears and continued screaming for their lives. I'll never forget those horrible screams. And then, out of nowhere, almost like a scene from a movie, I saw the person at the end get tackled by a police officer. The other 2 sprinted away, but didn't get very far, as they were also caught by the local police force. They were arrested, and when I saw the faces under the masks, I was almost more afraid. There were 3 young men, just normal-looking guys. I found out months later that 2 of the men were 20, and one of them was 18. My son thought these 3 masked men were ghosts because it was dark and they were dressed in all black. When they were apprehended, I was informed that all 3 of them had a knife on them, not just the one guy who showed his knife. I'm convinced these random young men were targeting us specifically, considering they kept coming back. After talking extensively with local law enforcement, apparently there's a group of punks in the area that target tourists, especially tourists with families. I guess they assume that tourists with families have more money, and when they have kids, they're easier targets. The police weren't overly concerned, which made me fear that this happens all too often. It makes me sad and angry that these types of people exist in the world. You hear stories like this all over the internet, but you never think it could happen to you, especially on vacation. The police seem to think that they wouldn't have physically harmed us and they only wanted our money, but no one knows what they were capable of doing if they were able to get through that sliding door. Not to mention, the mental scars we got from this trip will last a lifetime. Sometimes the mental scars are much more painful than the physical ones. I don't actually know what became of these men, and thankfully I'll never find out, because I will never be returning to that Airbnb or that beach town for the rest of my life.